In Congo by Michael Crichton, an American expedition braves the Congolian rainforest in a race against time to find rare diamonds, which may or may not be in a legendary lost city. In this video, I will be reviewing Congo using the 5P model, which was created by my friend BookGabber of BookTok. My version of her 5Ps have purpose, plot, etc., prose, personal, and position. I give a score for each of these categories and get the average of them for a final rating. But before I do that, I like to give a vibes rating. And what I mean by that is the post-reading pre-analysis reaction, which I distill into a number between 0 and 5. And the vibes number for Congo is 3.75 out of 5. So let's get started with purpose. What was Michael Crichton's intention in writing Congo? It was very much inspired by the 1970s as a really exciting decade for computing technology and a really scary decade for the environment. As we were progressing in leaps and bounds when it came to microelectronics, animals were losing so much of their natural habitats, and some of them were even becoming or had been critically endangered for some time. But Crichton does a bit more than the usual moral to these sorts of stories. Another ill effect of rapid development and exponential progress and an increase in power is that it can go to our heads, and we could end up becoming our own worst enemies. If hubris was a terrible fatal flaw, and is a terrible fatal flaw for individuals, it is, he would argue, even worse when it comes to civilizations. So for that, I give him a 4.5 out of 5. Now let's look at plot, etc., in which I evaluate the literary elements. I consider my big three: plot, character, and setting, and I give them mini ratings from which to get the plot, etc. rating. I normally start with plot, but for obvious reasons, let's start with setting. When Crichton set Congo in the Congo, he was very explicitly placing it in a literary tradition started by H. Rider Haggard when he wrote King Solomon's Mines. This adventure story tradition is one which I'd say we're not 100% comfortable with any longer. Foreigners, usually European or white foreigners, coming into Africa or any less developed area, fill in the blank, in order to have an exciting, dangerous adventure in a place that is depicted as rough and backwards. This use of countries which are actually actively involved in their own nation building and whose people are the main characters of their own stories, the depiction of these countries, these areas, as just a backdrop to someone else's story, well, it just doesn't seem very balanced. And if you're going to do it as a storyteller, you'd better have a darned good reason, and you'd better be respectful about it. I would say, as someone who wrote this book at the end of the 1970s, Crichton was as respectful as he was ever going to be. And I'd also say that he had a pretty good reason for choosing the Congolian rainforest. The legends associated with lost cities in Africa, diamonds as a huge mineral resource in the area, gorillas as animals native to the area, and some of the most naturally dangerous terrain on the planet. And all of these come together pretty much like the rainforest itself, which is layer upon layer of microenvironments. And to have the setting mirror the political and cultural and economic and technological layers in this way really does make it feel like it could not have been set in any other place in the world or even in any other time of history. So for setting, I give it a 5. Now for the plot. What is the story that he chose to tell in this incredible setting? It starts with a corporation that has sent an expedition into the Congolian rainforest in search of a very rare type of diamond. This diamond cannot be grown in a lab, at least not yet, and so it has to be mined. And because it is going to completely change the game when it comes to science, in a way similar to how splitting the atom changed the game several decades earlier, well, a lot of other corporations and countries are racing to get to the mines first. The problem is that the first expedition did not make it. They were attacked by something which, in the grainy footage, resembles a gray gorilla. Karen Ross, one of our protagonists, a 24-year-old mathematical prodigy who's very ambitious and driven, believes that she can succeed where this expedition failed. And she goes in with Charles Monroe, a mercenary who knows his way around Africa, but who has been linked to atrocities in the Congolese Civil War. Kahega, the porter Monroe likes to work with on missions like these. Peter Elliott, a gorilla researcher who has been teaching a gorilla to communicate with sign language. And Amy, the gorilla. And if that sounds a bit farcical, I'm sorry. It was not farcical when I was reading it. It made a lot of sense that these would be the main 4 going in as a team. And Congo is actually very tautly plotted. It is the 13 days, starting when Karen Ross is able to convince her boss to let her go in, to the day they all have to pull out. And something different happens on each day. As an adventure novel, it has a really good plot. Even if the flow of the story has to be interrupted occasionally by technological exposition. But I guess that's to be expected in this sort of science fiction novel. What I would say my biggest problem with the plot is what Crichton does towards the end. I'm going to be really vague here, even though this is obviously already a spoiler, but there's something that sets off the event of the climax, and it's pretty bad. On the surface, it makes sense, and Crichton even set up his story to make it make sense. This is only my second Crichton novel, but the first one also had a scene towards the end in which a character whose behavior and whose ideas Crichton disagreed with gets what's coming to him, or what Crichton would say was coming to him. And I really don't like saying this because I want to think of Crichton as a cool guy. It just really bothers me that the story unfolds the way it does because he wanted to teach an arrogant woman a lesson. It's the science fiction author's version of the lonely cat lady fantasy. So for this, I'm docking a point and giving Congo a 4 for plot. As for our characters, Karen, Peter, Monroe, Kahega, and even Amy the gorilla, they are all flat. No one really grows in the end as a response to what they experience in the Congo, well, we could say that they are chastened, especially Karen, but Crichton isn't really interested in developing them from within. What I do find hilarious is that he insists on making his nerds attractive. We are told that Peter Elliot is not just handsome, and that's the word Crichton uses, but also that he played college football and was a linebacker. And Karen is described as having, quote, youthful cheerleader beauty and a soft, seductive Texas accent. Well, okay, they're attractive people, but these descriptions have absolutely nothing to do with anything that happens to Peter and Karen, or anything Peter and Karen do for the rest of the novel. Anyway, I would say that the best character, and I am not joking, is Amy the gorilla. She really is the best. For character, I give Crichton a 2. When we get the average of those mini scores, we get a plot etc. score of 3.7 out of 5. Now let's talk about the prose. I like to describe the writing style using 3 words, and a meta thing I do is not repeat the 3 words in any of my 5 peer reviews. So my unique 3 words for the prose in Congo are rational, academic, and visionary. Crichton definitely has a great scope of vision when it comes to Congo. He puts together a lot of things that don't intuitively seem to go together, like microelectronics and African politics and animal rights advocacy and man's relationship to the animal world. And yet he makes them all fit into a nice mosaic of what the 1970s was like. Well, I would say that he ignores the things that I usually associate with the 70s, like the fashion, the music, the movies. But that's kind of understandable given what his focus was. And because so much of the book is technical, Crichton also sometimes writes as if he's writing nonfiction. And that's also one conceit of the novel. There are parts where the text mentions that Monroe said something in his testimony or Eliot said something afterwards, which makes it seem that the omniscient third-person narrator is someone who had to interview all of them and put together a report on what happened to the second expedition. But it's not just technical. There are some really beautiful passages in which Crichton is clearly awed. He feels wonder at not just the rainforest, but also what it represents. And to give you a sense of what I mean, and to share one of the better parts of his writing, I want to read a passage from the novel, chapter 5, in which they have to jump out of a plane. The minute they left the aircraft, they also left civilization and all the unquestioned assumptions of civilization. They were jumping not only through the air, but through time, backward into a more primitive and dangerous way of life, the eternal realities of the Congo, which had existed for centuries before them. It's the closest that a really rational mind can get to mysticism, and it's not bad. And having passages like this throughout the story shows that he is trying to elevate it from being just an adventure story. So for prose, I give him a 3.5 out of 5. Now we come to the personal category, as if I have not been sharing my personal thoughts throughout this video already. Reading it felt a lot like rummaging in my grandparents' attic and finding a box of old books which did not make the cut for the family library, but which also, for some reason or another, were not donated or given away or thrown away. And I would imagine that was because they were the mass market paperbacks that an uncle or an aunt or maybe one of my parents bought while away at university and brought home instead of leaving in the dorm after graduation. And if that sounds like a really messy metaphor, well, I have found that when I come up with these strange, extended, symbolic descriptions of my reactions to books, it's because I really, really like them. And honestly, if it were not for Crichton getting really ugly towards Karen at the end, which I am going to take personally, this would probably also have a perfect score or a close to perfect score for the personal category. As things stand, it gets a 4 out of 5. Finally, position. This is the category in which I look at a book's place in the literary canon or in pop culture. When I picked Michael Crichton to be one of the 3 canonical writers for my Rule of 3 plus 1 project, I thought he was a lot more influential than he probably is. And no wonder I thought so. Like Stephen King, he is one author whose name is bigger than the titles of his books. And I would say he wrote some really good pop science fiction novels, making some really technical concepts accessible to a mass readership. And that's also arguably why some of these novels became successful Hollywood movies. But it was actually really hard for me to get a copy of Congo for this reading project. The 2 biggest bookstores in my country did not carry it any longer, and the staff of one of them admitted that there were no plans to restock the book in the future. Even the used bookstores, which are usually good for vintage mass market paperbacks, did not have Congo, did not have much Crichton. And I ended up having to order this book from an online seller. It was not really my first choice, but it was literally the only copy I could find. And that's probably a really big indicator of how Crichton has held up over time. But even if Congo never becomes a proper classic, it is still a really good time capsule. And probably in that sense, a lot closer to the Roger Corman movies of the 70s and 80s, many of which were filmed in the Philippines, which is also turned into an exotic setting, with no real consideration for what the realities of life were for real Filipinos. But while those Corman flicks will never be considered classics, they have their own charm. When I sought them out a few years ago, I kind of liked them. And along those lines, while I'm glad that Congo had its day as a bestseller and a little wistful that it is slipping into obscurity like the lost city in its pages, I can also see that that is now a part of its unique charm. So although Congo did not age well, it still gets a position score of 3 out of 5. And when we add all those scores together, now that we've come to the end, Congo gets a 5P rating of 3.5 out of 5, which is not that bad. So what did you think of Congo? Have you read the book or seen the movie? And if you have, do you agree with my ratings and my thoughts? Do you think I should have rated it higher or maybe lower? Did you, like me, learn a little bit of sign language because Amy, the signing gorilla, was just so adorable?